So Tatjana Ostrovska is a Latvian violinist and researcher. She holds an MMUS degree from Guildhall School of Music and Drama and an MG Art degree from J. Vittel's Latvian Academy of Music, where she worked as violin and chamber music tutor for 5 years. In 2011, Tatjana co-founded chamber music ensemble Nix Trio. Recently, Nix Trio has released an album of chamber music works dedicated to the ensemble by Latvian contemporary composers, and the record label for that is Skani. Currently, Tatjana is a doctoral researcher at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. And her paper today is entitled The Invisible Audience, looking at the relationship between audience and the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, thank you so much for being with us, Tatjana, and for starting our conference. And I'll hand over to you.
So my presentation is about not just about COVID-19 pandemic, but it is influenced by that situation. So, but I wanted to go a bit way back, maybe even historically, to try to find some parallels. So, okay, let's start now. So, when COVID forced concert halls to close their doors, many musicians turned to live streaming technologies as means of making music accessible to audiences at home. Although all forms of streamed and recorded performance existed before the pandemic, a slightly different form, live stream performance without an in-person audience, has emerged in the last 2 years. For performers, live streamed events without the audience often resemble recording sessions more than live concerts. Yet, performers are still expected to deliver all the qualities listeners look for in a live concert: sense of occasion, risky and exciting performance, engagement with the non-existent or rather non-seen audience, all while knowing that any technical mistakes. Sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Okay, let me just start this slide from the beginning. So for performers, live-streamed events without the audience often resemble recording sessions more than live concerts. Yet, performers are still expected to deliver all the qualities listeners look for in a live concert: sense of occasion, risky and exciting performance, engagement with the non-existent or rather non-seen audience, all while knowing that any technical mistakes made during the performance will not vanish with the last sound of the concert. This situation has changed the way we performers perceive our own performance and how we interact with the audience, especially the invisible audience behind the screen. It raises many questions, some of which I would like to discuss today. Firstly, how do musicians react to the feedback from the part of the audience that remains invisible, which often comes days after the actual performance in the form of social media posts and comments? How can classical musicians increase and improve their interaction with the invisible audience? And finally, how to ensure the online performance reaches the audience in the form musicians have intended. The term invisible audience itself is used mostly in the field of sociology to discuss the realm of social media, where the invisible audience represents anyone who sees or interacts with one's social media posts. Everything posted on social media is seen by 4 times more people than we expect, and we can never be sure who will see or hear what we have posted. As Michael Bernstein writes, posting to a social network site is like speaking to an audience from behind a curtain. The audience remains invisible to the user. While the invitation list is known, the final attendance is not. Broader understanding of the term invisible audience could encompass any situation where one loses control over their creations and how they will be perceived or used as soon as larger audiences are allowed access to them online or via any form of technology. For example, the audience of the live event can be predicted to a certain extent. We can assume that the person who decided to attend the concert is either interested in the music performed or performers themselves. They have made a conscious decision to attend and will most likely play by the rules. Also, performers can be sure the audience will hear and see their performance as it was intended, in the appropriate acoustics and without any distractions. And most likely, the audience will stay until the end of performance and reward the artists with applause. When it comes to an online concert, especially the ones live streamed via social media, we cannot be sure of anything. At the moment of performance, we don't even know how many people are actually watching. We don't know what technology they use and what they hear. We don't even know if they are paying attention and when they decide to disconnect to go do other things. The only form of audience recognition in such concerts are likes and comments, which are often not even an indication the person has actually heard the performance. In my experience, I have noticed that live streamed events left on the social media for longer than 24 hours often double or even triple the views after even a couple of days and reach the number which would be impossible to reach in live concert situation. That often makes us performers wonder who are these people who seem to randomly click on a video days or even weeks after the actual event took place. How they search for this particular event or the algorithm of social media has suggested it to them. For me personally, the most uncomfortable part is the sharing option. You see that your event has been shared many times and you know you will never be able to trace where it has ended up. Although invisible audience now, in the age of social media, plays an important role in determining the popularity and success of the classical music performers, first hints of effect of the invisible audience can be traced back all the way to the invention of recording technologies. Before technologies, listening to music was almost always a group activity. People rarely listened to music alone because it usually accompanied social events, and performers were, of course, present and even central at those events. Even when the event consisted of two people, there always was a performer and a listener. The invention of the first recording technologies marked a major turning point in the relationships between performers and the audience. The recorded music became a product of its own, and performers realized very quickly that they had little to no control over who would listen to their playing, how their performance would sound, and how it would be perceived. In 1931, the magazine Disc stated some of the advantages of listening to music outside of the concert hall or any social event. Along with the phonograph, all the unpleasant externals are removed. The interpreter has been disposed of, the audience has been disposed of, the uncomfortable concert hall has been disposed of. You are alone with the composer and his music. Surely no more ideal circumstances can be imagined. Well, I suspect this unprecedented situation, and especially the ease with which many performers welcomed the new reality, may have been difficult for many performers to accept. The fact that the music could be perceived and consumed separately or independently without the direct presence and involvement of performers, and therefore often without recognition, may have been the root of the feelings of resentment many performers feel towards recording technologies to this day. The invention of tape recordings and therefore the editing of recording material opened new possibilities for performing artists. The studio recording could now reach the level of perfection that could not be achieved in the live performance. However, striving for technical perfection began to pose a potential threat to one of the basic features of music, the emotional interaction between the performer and the audience. Pianist Douglas MacLennan says, the culture of perfect edited recordings has had a negative impact on concerts. From an audience perspective, listeners used to technically perfect recordings come to performances with an expectation of every note in place. Performers who understand that the bar is set at technical perfection work with that goal in mind. In other words, the striving for artificial perfection created a wall between musicians and listeners. The prioritization of perfection achieved through repeated takes and editing was at odds with the expression and excitement performers aimed for in a live concert. The invisible audience unintentionally had begun to dictate the course of live performances. The relationships between the performers and listeners became even more complicated when the World Wide Web was introduced. This development allowed performances to be live streamed all over the world and to reach more people than ever, especially once the devices to access online performances, such as computers and cell phones, became affordable and therefore accessible to larger audiences. As Eric Clark states, never before have people had access to so much music and in so many different ways and with so many different patterns of use. Online events allowed performers to reach more people. Live stream performance was more affordable in terms of both money and time invested by the listeners. Also, live streamed concerts became a way to reach listeners who live in more obscure places, far from any concert hall or culture venue, and before were limited to the pre-recorded performances without the element of liveness to them, which is the main difference if we compare recordings and live streams. As Andy Lavender describes live stream performances, this is, on the one hand, a straightforward model of broadcast, but it strikes me as important because it has become part of a cultural milieu that continues to privilege presentness or liveness over presence or being there. This situation led to an unprecedented power shift. Alongside the audience in the concert hall, the invisible audience online became an undeniable force in determining the success or failure of an artist. Alongside the unpredictability of the online audience, portable recording devices, also known as mobile phones, became more affordable to the listeners, which meant that even if the performance was not live streamed or broadcasted, performers could never be sure which part of their performance, even the unsuccessful ones, and especially the unsuccessful ones, will be recorded and emerge somewhere on the internet. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, live streaming became common practice for many musicians. The cancellations of live performances led to an inevitable shift from offline live music performances to online music live streams, trying to reconnect isolated listeners with equally isolated performers. As part of my doctoral research, I have interviewed several classical musicians in order to find out how they feel about the invisible part of the audience and if they even pay attention to it. The interviews happened during the period real-time concerts were restricted almost everywhere in the world, and performers were only beginning to adjust to this situation. While analyzing the data of the interviews and during the process of interviewing, I tried to take into consideration the emotional state of the performers, which often displayed as anxiety, stress, and uncertainty. The answers, therefore, often were very emotional, which served as a clear indication of the real impact of this situation on performers. The shift to online events also shifted the perspective of many performers. Once the natural bond between the listener and the performer was so abruptly broken, many musicians struggled to find the immediate replacement to it. What they felt instead was often unexplainable anxiety and feeling of emptiness. The word that stood out the most in almost every interview was pressure, which was used now to describe more than just the usual pressure to deliver the best possible performance. In addition to this common type of pressure we as musicians have learned to deal with, the word now seemed to be linked a lot to another word, control or lack of control. Considering the fact live-streamed concerts existed before the pandemic, I was interested to pinpoint the reason why these concerts suddenly felt so awkward for many performers. The most obvious explanation was the lack of audience, specifically the lack of audience performers could interact with, but there was more to it. Many performers suddenly realized they have been ignoring the invisible audience in the live-streamed concerts before the pandemic and concentrating only on the audience in the concert hall. Now, when the audience has been removed, many performers felt the pressure to connect with the audience behind the screen, and they struggled to find the ways how to effectively accomplish that. The link between words pressure and control seemed very interesting to me, and I tried to trace the words musicians used to describe both and find the connection if there was one. The set of technical and emotional aspects such as sound quality, technical precision, phrasing, interpretation, and visual presentation undoubtedly determines the quality of every performance. The pressure to deliver this perfect performance is not a new feeling for professional musicians, and the most effective way to achieve the best possible result is to have a complete control over all aspects of performance. That means to practice enough to have as much information as possible about the background of the musical piece and composer, to familiarize themselves with the acoustics of the concert venue, to make sure the intended concert outfit is comfortable and aesthetically appropriate. I assume each performer has their own individual list of actions to follow. The feedback of the audience in form of applause, flowers, and requested encores serves as a confirmation that the preparation process and the performance had been successful. So far, this equation has been working for most performers, and pressure was effectively replaced with control. So what happened when the live-streamed events without the audience took over the music world? Why so many musicians suddenly struggled to apply control to deal with the pressure? The musicians pointed out that it felt like they cannot control many important aspects of their performance, such as sound quality via live stream, the technology people are using to watch the live stream, the visual presentation of performance. Many confessed they were very aware of the invisible audience watching behind the screen, and that made them feel more exposed for various reasons, mainly because of not being able to control their sound and image. The lack of control over the end result of their own performance turned out to be the biggest stress factor of live-streamed concerts for many performers, including myself. It was even more amplified by the fact there were no audience present. Therefore, the only version of performance that would reach the listeners was the one created by the sound and video engineers, not by the natural acoustics of the venue and by performers themselves. Many performers expressed their concerns about the way audiences are responding to online events, especially during the pandemic, when live events were non-existent or happened in very restricted capacity. The interviews revealed concerns about whether we, performers, know what the audience expects from live-streamed events, and if what we create is the same as what the audience wants to hear and see. Although live events with in-person audience have resumed almost everywhere in the world by now, the live-streamed events will still happen, probably even more often than before the pandemic, because many concert venues have realized the advantages of their online concerts and now have the equipment, knowledge, and experience in organizing such events. However, the pandemic and concerts without the in-person audience have definitely made us performers to rethink our attitude towards the invisible audience and realize its importance in defining our professional success. Thank you for your attention.